The message arrived on a Thursday afternoon when I was doing the most ordinary thing in the world, trimming hedges in front of my house in Columbus, Ohio. I was 64 years old, retired from the utility company for 3 years. My knees had started complaining about physical activity, but I persisted anyway because my wife, Linda, had always said that maintaining a home was a form of meditation. She'd been dead for 8 years, but I still followed her logic on most things. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled off my gardening gloves, the ones Linda had bought me for our 30th anniversary, and checked the message. My daughter, Ashley. We'd been texting casually all week about the wedding, which was happening in 3 weeks. She was marrying a man named Trevor, whom I'd known for almost 3 years. Everyone seemed happy. Everything seemed normal. Then I read the actual message. You can come to the wedding if you sign the house over to me, but don't expect a seat up front. I read it 3 times. My hands, which had been steady while holding pruning shears above my head, started shaking. I looked around the yard as if someone might suddenly appear and explain what I was reading. The maple tree Ashley and I had planted when she was 7 stood in the distance, tall and healthy. The hedges I'd been trimming for the past hour looked professionally groomed. Everything was perfect. Nothing made sense. I sat down on the concrete steps leading to my back door and stared at the phone screen. This couldn't be my daughter. This couldn't be the little girl who used to run to me when I came home from work, who insisted on adopting a 3-legged dog from the shelter, who'd held my hand when her mother was dying. But it was. Another message came through immediately. Dad, Trevor, and I think this is the smartest way to secure our future. My stomach dropped. Then a third message. Mom would have wanted us to have stability. That one made me stand up so quickly I nearly lost my balance. I walked inside the house without finishing the hedge trimming. I made myself a cup of coffee even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. I sat in the kitchen at the exact spot where Linda used to read her morning newspaper, and I reread the messages. What I realized was that this hadn't come from nowhere. It had been building. I'd just been too willing to ignore the evidence because she was my daughter, and I loved her, and love is supposed to mean you don't see things clearly sometimes. I thought about the subtle shifts over the past 2 years. The way Trevor would comment on my property value. The way Ashley had gradually stopped calling every Sunday. The way conversations had shifted from "How are you, Dad?" to "Do you ever think about downsizing?" The way they'd both become obsessed with financial security and building assets. I'd rationalized every warning sign. But this text message couldn't be rationalized. My phone rang. Ashley. I sent it to voicemail. It rang again. And again. By the time it rang for the 5th time, I turned off the sound entirely. That evening, I heated up leftover chili and sat in my recliner, barely tasting it. The television played something I couldn't focus on. My mind kept replaying that text, analyzing it, looking for some interpretation that would make it less cruel. I found none. Around 9 p.m., a longer message arrived on my phone. I read the first few lines. Transferring the house would demonstrate your commitment to supporting our future. This is about making smart financial decisions. We've given this considerable thought. The message went on for 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph made it worse. Not once did she ask how I felt. Not once did she acknowledge that she was asking me to give away the home where she'd grown up, where Linda and I had spent 32 years building a life, where Ashley's height was still marked on the kitchen doorway. I stared at the blinking cursor for nearly 20 minutes, composing and deleting responses. Finally, I typed 1 sentence and hit send before I could change my mind. Then I'll keep the deed and you can keep the seat. My phone immediately began ringing. 12 calls before midnight. I answered none of them. The next morning, I did something I should have probably done earlier. I called my attorney, Frank Delaney. We'd known each other for over 20 years. He'd handled paperwork for Linda and me when we were younger. Over the decades, he'd become more than a lawyer. He'd become someone who told you the truth even when you didn't want to hear it. I told him I was coming in. He asked why. I sent him the text messages. When I walked into his office downtown that afternoon, the first thing he said was, "That's a hell of a wedding invitation." But neither of us was laughing. Frank's office smelled like old coffee and leather-bound law books. He sat behind his desk, reading the messages on my phone with an expression that grew increasingly grim. When he finally looked up, He asked a question that caught me completely off guard. How many times have you bailed her out, Robert? What do you mean? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. You know what I mean. Financially. After Linda died, I looked out his window. The courthouse was visible in the distance. Somewhere in that building, people were fighting over property and custody and money. I'd always felt grateful that my family didn't fight about those things. Apparently, I'd been wrong. I started listing them. After Linda passed away, Ashley was 23 years old. Grief had hit both of us hard, but we grieved differently. I threw myself into work. Ashley struggled. There was a missed rent payment in 2018 that I covered, a maxed-out credit card that same year, then a car that needed repairs she couldn't afford, then student loans that became problematic, then another financial emergency, then another. Every single time, I stepped in. Why? Frank asked simply. Because she was my daughter. Because Linda wasn't there anymore. Because I wanted to help. Frank folded his hands on his desk. Robert, helping somebody and protecting them from consequences aren't always the same thing. The words hung in the air. I hated that he was right. Tell me about Trevor, Frank said. So I did. I talked about how Trevor had seemed perfect at first, well-spoken, employed in financial consulting, always polite. But the polite exterior had hidden something else. He talked about money constantly, not because he needed it, but because he seemed fascinated by it in an obsessive way. Every conversation drifted back to investments, assets, leverage, wealth building. One Thanksgiving, he'd looked around my dining room and said, "You've got a lot of equity sitting here." I'd laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. Another time, he'd asked what my retirement accounts looked like. I'd changed the subject. Ashley had barely noticed. How long have you sensed something was wrong? Frank asked. A year, maybe longer, but I kept thinking I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own fears onto the situation. Frank opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder. He set it on the desk between us. We need to talk about the trust. My shoulders relaxed slightly. The trust. The one thing Ashley didn't know about. Years earlier, after Linda died and I'd spent time mourning and eventually recovering, I'd made a decision. Not immediately, not emotionally. It took nearly 2 years of thinking. I'd met a veteran named Carl through our church who'd lost his wife and then his house. Within 18 months, he'd lost almost everything. Around the same time, I'd met 2 widows struggling to keep roofs over their heads. Hardworking people one disaster away from losing everything. Linda used to say that if you were fortunate enough to have something valuable, you should leave part of it behind to help somebody else. So I'd created an irrevocable charitable housing trust. When I died, the house would eventually be used to support housing programs for veterans and widows. The paperwork had been finalized years ago. The house was already protected. Does Ashley know about this? Frank asked. No. Does Trevor know? No. Frank nodded slowly. Then you understand what's happening here. I did understand. They'd made demands assuming the house was still mine to give. They'd built plans around an inheritance that didn't exist. They'd orchestrated pressure based on a false premise. But what I didn't understand, what I couldn't understand, was how my daughter had become a stranger to me. Frank closed the folder. The house is protected. The trust is solid. Nobody can touch it. That's not what's bothering me, I admitted. It's not about the house anymore. It's about Ashley. The fact that she made the demand at all. The fact that she thought it was reasonable. Frank stood up and walked to his window. After a long moment, he said something that would stay with me for months. Sometimes parents spend so much time protecting their children that they never teach them how to protect themselves from their own worst instincts. I had no response to that. The email arrived 3 days later by complete accident. I was sitting at my computer paying bills when a message appeared in my inbox from Trevor. The subject line was retirement planning draft. At first, I thought it was intentional. Then I noticed it wasn't addressed to me at all. Apparently, Trevor had mistyped an email address by 1 letter, and it had landed in my inbox instead of wherever he'd intended. I should have deleted it immediately. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a spreadsheet with multiple tabs. Detailed notes. Property values. Investment projections. Retirement estimates. I scrolled slowly, a sick feeling building in my stomach. One section listed my house. Another estimated future inheritance scenarios. Another projected asset transfers over the next 10 years. Then I reached a section labeled long-term opportunities. My name appeared multiple times. Not as a father, not as family, as a variable, as a financial event, as a line item in a plan. I closed the laptop. I sat in the living room. I tried to make sense of what I'd just read, but there was no sense to make. It was calculation. Pure, simple, cold calculation. That evening, I sat in Linda's reading chair, the one she claimed was Hayes and nobody else's. On the bookshelf was a photograph of the three of us at Lake Erie. Ashley was 14, missing one front tooth, laughing at something I couldn't remember. Linda's arm was around her shoulders. My hand was on her head. I looked at that photograph for a very long time. And then I did something I hadn't done in 8 years. I spoke out loud to my deceased wife. I don't know when we started losing her, I said to the empty room. I don't know when she stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an asset. The house fell silent. The next morning, I called Frank back. I told him about the email. I didn't ask for advice about how to respond. I asked something else entirely. What do I do if she's already made a choice? What if there's no coming back from this? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You do what you've always done. You tell the truth. And you hope that eventually, she recognizes it." The pressure started immediately after the wedding rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant along the river outside Cincinnati. Nice place. White tablecloths. Expensive wine. The kind of venue designed to make people feel important. When I arrived, conversations dipped slightly. Not obviously, just enough to notice. Word had spread. Apparently, Ashley had been talking about me, about the house, about my stubborn refusal to do what she wanted. Most of the family had sided with her. My sister Nancy called first. "Robert, what are you doing? It's just a house." My aunt called next. Family is more important than property. An old family friend called with a story about compromise and weddings and not letting pride ruin important moments. I listened to each one, then politely ended each conversation. Not because I was angry, but because they didn't know the full story. Ashley had presented a version of events that made her look reasonable and me look stubborn. Very few people knew about the email, about the financial planning spreadsheet, about how I was being categorized as a long-term opportunity. The strangest part was how reasonable everything sounded when you removed those details. "Just sign over the house," people would say. What's the big deal? People always minimize things that don't directly affect them. They say things like just a house when they're not the ones being asked to give it away. A week before the wedding, something unexpected happened that nearly changed everything. I was in my backyard watering the plants when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. Ashley, alone. No Trevor. No audience. Just my daughter. For the first time in days, my heart lifted. We went inside. I made coffee. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ashley started crying. Real tears. Not manipulative, at least not intentionally. And when your child cries, something primitive inside you wants to fix it. I almost fell for it. She talked about wedding stress, about financial pressure, about how scared she was about the future. And honestly, some of it sounded genuine. I found myself remembering all the reasons I loved her. The little girl with the red bicycle. The teenager who insisted on saving the three-legged dog. The young woman who sat beside her mother's hospital bed every night. For a moment, I believed we might find our way back. Then she took a deep breath and said, "Just sign the house over, Dad. If you do that, everything can go back to normal." The word hung in the air. Normal. As if giving away my home was an inconvenience. As if the problem wasn't the demand itself. As if the demand was perfectly reasonable and I was the unreasonable one. She reached across the table. I saw it coming and I didn't pull away. I let her take my hand because she was my daughter. "Trevor says if you transfer the house to us, we can set up a rental property business and build real wealth," she continued, squeezing my hand. "We'll even give you a percentage of the profits. You be helping us, and you be making money on top of it. It's win-win." That's when something inside me finally broke. Not with anger, with clarity. Ashley, stop. She blinked. What? Stop talking about what Trevor says. Stop trying to convince me this is reasonable. And stop trying to make me complicit in your plan. She pulled her hand back like I'd burned her. This is exactly why we need to do this. You're not being supportive. I'm being realistic, I said quietly. And I'm being honest, which is something that's been in short supply in this conversation. She left shortly after that, and I knew something fundamental had shifted. The little hope I'd been holding on to, that this was all a misunderstanding, that we could fix it, finally cracked completely. But I still didn't know the worst was yet to come. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 5:30 and couldn't fall back asleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not grief, exactly. Something more like resignation. The kind of feeling that comes when you've finally accepted something you've been resisting for a long time. I got up and made coffee. I stepped onto the back deck and watched the sunrise. The maple tree Ashley and I planted together was tall now, much taller than the house. It swayed gently in the morning breeze, strong and rooted in exactly where it was supposed to be. I wondered if Ashley would ever understand that stability doesn't come from owning things. It comes from knowing who you are. By noon, I was dressed and heading towards Cincinnati. The wedding venue sat on the outskirts of town, a renovated historic estate surrounded by gardens and old oak trees. Beautiful place. Parking attendants directed guests. People smiled and laughed and carried gifts. Nobody knew what was about to happen. I arrived at 1:30, intentionally late enough to avoid standing around making small talk. As I entered, several relatives spotted me. A few looked relieved. Others looked uncomfortable. I could practically read their minds. Here comes Robert. Hope nobody brings up the house. I found a seat in the very last row. About 40 minutes before the ceremony, my phone vibrated. A text from Trevor. Can we talk? I knew exactly what this was. One final negotiation. One last attempt to convince me that signing over my house was the reasonable choice. A venue employee directed me toward a small hallway behind the ballroom. Trevor was waiting with Ashley beside him. The second I saw their expressions, I understood the dynamic completely. This wasn't a desperate plea. This was a final power play. Trevor smiled his polished smile. Robert, thank you for coming. What did you want to talk about? I asked, though I already knew. There's still time to make this right, Trevor said, his voice carefully measured. To fix things before the ceremony. Fix them by signing over the house, I said flatly. It wasn't a question. It would solve everything, Ashley added, her voice almost pleading. We could go back to normal. We could still have our wedding. I reached into my jacket pocket. Both of them straightened immediately, their eyes lighting up with hope. For a second, they genuinely thought I'd agreed. That I brought the deed or a signed document or something that would finally give them what they wanted. Instead, I pulled out a FedEx envelope, thick and sealed. I handed it to Trevor. Open it. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. The color drained from his face. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. What is this? He demanded. The truth, I said. He flipped through the pages frantically, as if different words might magically appear. They didn't. The documents clearly showed that the house had been transferred into an irrevocable charitable housing trust years earlier. Protected. Permanent. Completely untouchable. Ashley grabbed the papers from his hands. Her eyes scanned the legal language, desperately searching for some loophole, some way to make this not real. You put the house in a trust. Her voice was barely a whisper. Yes. Years ago. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I looked directly at her, because I kept hoping my daughter cared more about me than my property. And that's when Trevor exploded. Not physically, verbally. His carefully managed facade shattered completely. He started shouting about how I'd manipulated the situation, how I'd deliberately hidden this information, how Ashley had lied to him about the house being available. That's when something shifted in Ashley's expression. The desperation disappeared. The hope vanished. And in its place came something far worse, realization. Wait, she said quietly, looking at Trevor. You're angry about the house. You're not angry about lying to me or manipulating me. You're angry about losing access to an asset. Trevor blinked. For a second, he didn't understand what had happened. He'd lost control. The mask had slipped, and his daughter had finally seen what was underneath it. We're done, Ashley said quietly. What? Trevor couldn't process it. We're done, she repeated, stronger this time. No wedding. We're done. She walked away. Her bridesmaids followed. Several nearby guests had stopped pretending not to listen. Whispers spread through the venue. Questions followed, but I barely heard any of it. The ceremony never happened. The venue slowly emptied. Guests left confused. The event that was supposed to be the biggest day of Ashley's life ended in disaster before it ever began. And for the first time in weeks, nobody was asking me for my house. For the first few weeks after the canceled wedding, Ashley didn't contact me. No calls, no texts, no attempts at reconciliation. Just silence. I didn't know what I expected. Part of me thought she'd call immediately, furious that I'd humiliated her in front of everyone. Part of me thought she'd never call again, convinced that I'd somehow betrayed her by protecting what was mine. The reality was silence. My life became oddly quiet. The constant tension that had defined the previous weeks simply disappeared. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays. I tended the garden. I watched the Reds have another frustrating season. Life moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to human drama. A month after the canceled wedding, I heard through relatives that Trevor had moved out of Ashley's apartment. This happened less than 2 weeks after what would have been their wedding day. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how completely he vanished. 3 years together. Gone. Just like that. Sometimes people tell you exactly who they are. You just don't recognize it until later. 3 months after the wedding, something unexpected happened that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about the situation. Frank called me. You got a minute? He asked. Sure, I said. What's up? I thought you'd want to know something. Your daughter showed up at one of the housing projects. That caught my attention. The charitable trust partnered with several local organizations throughout Ohio, mostly housing assistance programs for widows, seniors, and veterans. I knew volunteers occasionally helped with repairs and maintenance, but Ashley had never shown interest before. What was she doing? I asked. Painting walls. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't imagine Ashley spending a Saturday painting walls. Yet apparently, that's exactly what she'd done. Has she mentioned it? Frank asked carefully. No, she hasn't mentioned anything. We barely talk. Well, she's been back 3 times now. Different projects each time. Always shows up alone. Always works the entire day. Never asked for anything. Nobody there even knew she was your daughter until the coordinator recognized your last name. I didn't know what to make of this information. Was she doing it to prove something to me? Was she seeking forgiveness? Was she just lost and trying to find her way? Keep me updated, I told Frank. Over the next few months, I learned that Ashley had become a regular volunteer. She showed up every other Saturday. Sometimes she painted. Sometimes she helped with repairs. Once she helped an elderly widow clear out her garage. The project's coordinator had mentioned that Ashley sometimes stayed late, just talking to the people there, listening to their stories. I didn't know what to do with this information. I didn't contact her about it. I didn't tell her I knew. I just waited. 6 months after the canceled wedding, autumn had arrived in Columbus. The leaves were changing colors. The mornings felt cooler. On a Sunday afternoon in October, rain tapped softly against the windows while I sat in the living room reading. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Ashley stood on the porch. She looked different. Not physically. Something else. The urgency she'd carried for the previous 2 years seemed gone. The tension around her eyes had softened. Hi, Dad, she said quietly. Hi, I replied, uncertain what to do. She glanced toward her car. I brought coffee. She was holding a cardboard carrier with 2 cups from a local coffee shop. I almost smiled despite myself. Linda used to bring me coffee when she'd done something wrong and needed to apologize. Ashley apparently remembered this tradition. Well, you'd better come in then, I said. We sat at the kitchen table, The same kitchen table where we'd had our worst conversations. Rain fell outside. Coffee steamed between us. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. That felt important somehow. Eventually, Ashley took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. Not because I was angry, but because I wanted to hear what she would say without prompting. For the next several minutes, she talked. Really talked. Not like a daughter trying to win an argument. Like an adult taking responsibility. She admitted she'd become obsessed with building the future she thought she deserved. She admitted that Trevor's ideas had influenced her, but she didn't blame him for her choices. That mattered. It showed she understood that she was responsible for her own decisions. "I kept telling myself I was being practical," she said quietly, staring into her coffee. "I stopped thinking about people and started thinking about outcomes." The honesty surprised me. Not because she was admitting fault, but because she wasn't trying to defend herself while doing it. Then she told me about the housing projects, about meeting a widow who'd nearly lost her home after her husband died, about a veteran struggling to rebuild his life after losing everything, about spending weekends listening to stories instead of making financial plans. "You know what the embarrassing part is?" she asked. "What?" I finally understood why Mom would have supported the trust. That one landed deep. We sat quietly for a while. The rain continued outside. Neither of us seemed eager to rush the moment. Eventually, Ashley looked at me. "I thought losing the wedding was the worst thing that happened. But it wasn't." I waited. "The worst thing was realizing I almost lost you," she said, tears finally spilling over. "I was so focused on what you could give me that I forgot to appreciate what you'd already given me. My entire life." I set down my coffee. "Ashley, I need to tell you something. After your mother died, I made mistakes. I solved your problems instead of teaching you how to solve them. I protected you from consequences instead of letting you learn. That's on me." She shook her head. "Dad, I'm responsible for my choices. You didn't make me do this. I did this. I chose to listen to Trevor. I chose to make that demand. I chose to prioritize money over our relationship. But..." "No," she interrupted, and there was strength in her voice now. "I need to own this. Because if I don't own my mistakes, I'll spend my whole life blaming other people for my choices. I don't want to be that person." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and I saw someone I'd never met before. Not the little girl from years ago. Not the woman who'd sent that text message. Someone new. Someone still learning. Someone honest. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," I replied. As Ashley was leaving that October afternoon, she paused at the doorway with her hand on the frame. "Dad, there's something else I need to tell you," she said. "Something I haven't told anyone yet." My stomach tightened. I'd thought we'd reached the end of revelations. Apparently, we hadn't. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "After Trevor moved out, I found some things on his laptop. Accidentally. He'd left it at my place, and I was using it to look up something, and his email was still open, and I saw a message chain." I sat back down. A message chain to who? To someone named Marcus. Apparently, Trevor has been doing this for a long time. He targets women. Successful women with assets. He gets close to them. He spends years studying their finances, understanding what they own, figuring out how to access it. And then he moves in for the kill. My chest went cold. "Ashley." "There were 8 women in the files," she continued, her voice shaking. 8. I looked them up. 3 of them lost their homes. 2 had to completely reorganize their lives financially. 1 had a stroke from stress. "Did you go to the police?" "I did," she said. "But without him actually taking anything or causing physical harm. They said there's not much they can do. They took the information. They said they'd investigate. But I don't know if anything will come of it." I processed this information slowly. What Ashley was telling me was that I'd been luckier than I realized. The trust had protected me, but it had also protected her from becoming a victim of a much larger crime. "There's more," Ashley said quietly. "The reason I'm telling you this is because the police contacted me about Trevor. They said he's been arrested. Not because of me. Because of someone else. Someone he targeted before me." "What do you mean?" "His first real target. A woman named Victoria. She recognized him. She'd been researching him for years because she was convinced he was the person who'd caused her mother's death. Apparently, her mother had literally died of a heart attack when she realized she'd been manipulated out of everything. I couldn't speak. All I could think was how close I'd come. How close Ashley had come. The woman, Victoria, she'd been quietly building a case for over a decade, Ashley continued. She'd finally gathered enough evidence that when the police looked into it, they found everything. Trevor's going to trial. For a moment, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. My daughter had almost married a predator. A man who systematically targeted women with assets and exploited them. A man who viewed people as financial variables, just like the spreadsheet had shown. And I'd been right to protect my house. Not because Ashley couldn't be trusted with it, but because Trevor never would have allowed her to have it. The moment they'd owned it, he would have maneuvered her into some other situation. There would have been another demand, another manipulation, another scheme. The trust hadn't just protected my property. It had protected my daughter. The volunteer work, I said slowly. That's why you started it, isn't it? Ashley nodded. I realized that Trevor had spent 3 years making me feel like helping people was a waste of money. He'd convinced me that security meant accumulation. But it doesn't. Security means knowing you're not someone who can be easily destroyed. Security means having integrity. Ashley, I volunteer because those people matter, she said. Not because I'm trying to prove something to you or fix something I broke. I volunteer because finally, I understand what Mom meant about using what you have to help other people. It's not about the money. It's about understanding that other people's struggles are real and valid and worth your time. After she left, I stood in the doorway watching her drive away in the rain. I thought about everything that had happened. The text message, the trust, the wedding that never happened, the volunteer work that had changed her in ways I hadn't anticipated. I thought about how the worst moments sometimes contain hidden blessings. How what seemed like betrayal from my daughter might have actually been protection by the universe. How sometimes you don't realize you're being saved until much later. The next morning, I received a call from Frank. He'd heard about Trevor's arrest through his legal channels. Your instinct was correct, he said. This man was dangerous. I know, I replied. Your daughter realized it too, Frank said. That takes courage. After we hung up, I walked into the kitchen and looked at the pencil marks on the doorway. The measurements of Ashley's growth. Age 6, age 9, age 12, age 16, age 18. The last one was from her senior year of high school, before she'd left for college. I took a pen and very carefully marked a new line. Then I wrote the date and labeled it, age 31. The day she finally saw clearly. Not because I was angry, because I wanted to remember that sometimes the people we love most have to learn the hardest lessons in the most painful ways. And sometimes, if we're lucky enough, they find their way back to us on the other side of that learning. The house still stood. The trust still protected it. Ashley was still my daughter. But we were both different people now. We both understood something we hadn't understood before. Love isn't about what you give. It's about knowing who deserves to receive it. And sometimes, saying no is the most profound way of saying yes to the right future.